gentlemen, today I'm going to talk to you about two issues that have come up in this debate, and I hope that by the time I finish this speech, you'll understand why everyone kept banging on about rights without ever telling you why they were talking about it. You'll understand why Alon has explained to you the value of other conceptions of the good and why this is all meaningful and why it means that on our side we've won the debate. I'm going to talk firstly about happiness versus other conceptions of the good, and I apologise in advance, this speech will have a lot of wanky debate terminology. Secondly, I'm going to talk to you about the effect of this policy on the government and on the value of having a plurality of metrics in society. Told you so. So, the idea of happiness versus other conceptions of the good. Because, ladies and gentlemen, uncontroversially, there are other conceptions of good. As I said in my POI, in the very, very first speech, there are mothers who would sacrifice their life to save their child. The response from proposition was, yes, she'll be happy after she did that. I think he didn't quite understand the use of the word sacrifice. There are other values of good, ladies and gentlemen. There are people who believe that justice is more important than happiness. There are people who believe that honour is more important than happiness, that power is more important, that the intrinsic value of human life is more important, that equality is more important. There are people who value one kind of pleasure over another, and that's something we've never heard about from proposition. Why it might be that some people prefer getting drunk and going to that amazing club from last night. Other people prefer to make a good argument. And Derek tried to mention to you in this speech, he mentioned to you other values of conceptions of the good, but I'm going to tell you why it's relevant. It's relevant because, ladies and gentlemen, the proposition's burden today is to tell you why happiness is equal to the good. And that is something that they categorically cannot do. They in fact have realised that they categorically cannot do. Because in Kieran's speech just now, he finished off talking about interests instead of talking about happiness. He has already fallen into talking about another conception of the good, in fact a totally different one. And all of these conceptions of the good, ladies and gentlemen, are just as plausible as happiness. We don't have to show you that one is better as a conception of the good than happiness is. We have to show you that they're all equally plausible. And as I've said, proposition has to show you that happiness is the only, they've completely failed to do so. And that's why, ladies and gentlemen, everyone kept talking about rights. That's why, ladies and gentlemen, we have rights already. That's why we feel that rights are so important. Because these rights are based in the ideas I've just told you about. They're based in ideas like equality. They're based in ideas like the intrinsic value of human life. And these are things that a metric of happiness alone cannot give you. And that's why, ladies and gentlemen, and minorities, which I'm going to talk about in a second, have become such a big issue in this debate. Because, ladies and gentlemen, contrary to what proposition has told you, thinking about happiness alone cannot lead you to helping minorities. Second of all, the fact that proposition kept talking about minorities shows that they recognise in their hearts that we should care about minorities. It shows that they recognise in their hearts that the metric they're trying to convince you today is a flawed metric. It cannot be the only metric. So, ladies and gentlemen, these alternative conceptions of the good should be recognised as long as proposition have failed to show that a priori happiness equals the good. So let's talk specifically about minorities. Because, ladies and gentlemen, as I've just said, proposition's discussion presumes we should care about minorities. We can only care about minorities when we care about a notion of equality. Because as opening government they told you, they want to be radical. If you care about happiness and you want to be radical, you should euthanize all the sad people, redistribute their money, and use it to buy ice cream for the people who aren't so sad anymore. What's going to happen to society when you care only about happiness? Well, you incentivize the government to care about those who are easiest to make happy. It means that, for example, poor people who it would require loads and loads of effort to make their lives very happy are ignored, whereas rich people who it's very, very easy to make much happier by giving them a massive tax break are listened to. It means that when they try to say that you're not going to put the preferences of bigots above the people who have concerns to do with equality. Well, first of all, to try and do that, as I've said, proposition talked about interests instead. They started saying that we care about the core interests. And ladies and gentlemen, proposition tried to tell you further that you will never have these extreme cases in which in which a load of sadistic people's pleasure outweighs pain. Ladies and gentlemen, even if it's not a boring numbers game, as Kieran tried to introduce to you new in his summary speech, the fact that you're quantifying happiness means that the pleasure of some people can always going to eventually be able to outweigh this pain. Kieran told you that we brought you an Oxford sci-fi kind of case. Ladies and gentlemen, if I give Kieran sufficient amounts of morphine, he will be very, very happy. He will presumably regard that not as the best possible outcome of the Red Sea Open. So, ladies and gentlemen, when the proposition tells you that it's not numbers-based, they're flat out contradicting themselves. When they try and tell you that the government is being pragmatic, not only is that new, but to say that the government is putting the most important people to make happy at the top, you're already saying you're considering something other than happiness. Yeah, I'll take opening.
Thank you. So, we define happiness subjectively, so everyone defines it according to their concept of the good, which means we're not ignoring, we're taking everyone into account.
We think that's flat out impossible to do in the way that you're suggesting. We think that that's like just completely counteracts what you've been saying about how policy is going to be made. So the effect on government and the value of the proactive metric. So they've tried to tell you that their policy counteracts the idea of lobbying groups, religious groups. But as Elon has told you, your argument is based on happiness. And if these groups get big enough, they will be the ones made most happy by tying along. The fact that you think these lobby groups are problematic already shows that you agree with us that there are other values besides happiness. So ladies and gentlemen, what happens to discourse? Because even if what we want is happiness, what happens under your policy is that you limit discourse to be entirely about happiness. You mean that policies are only discussed in terms of whether they make people happy or whether your policy makes people happy. But we think that there are other kinds of policies that can be created. Policies centered around increasing a nation's power, policies about the value of human life. We think that gives you a wider range of ideas, ladies and gentlemen. So even if you only care about happiness, which is a nonsense, we believe that their policy is going to be seriously damaging to human discourse, because you're suddenly going to lose all the ideas. You're going to have ideas that wouldn't arise if you were purely talking about happiness. And so, when Kieran says you should consider the effects of education and such on human happiness, well, firstly, that's because happiness is a trade-off, and that's why your absolute idea of happiness is going to fail first of all. And secondly, we think that you're going to just miss out on policies. So, ladies and gentlemen, because the propositions have to show you that happiness equals the good, and they can't possibly do that, haven't even tried, because this is going to substantially damage human discourse, we beg you to vote.
Thank you very much for that speech. Thank you very much for this.